Hello, beautiful community. I'm little by little making a video for the main channel about the fears and pitfalls and challenges that might beset Putin in the event of negotiations to stop the war in 2025. But a few of you have asked me to comment on Zelensky's current predicament, how strong, how weak he is. And we're going to have to draw a very sharp line, which we won't transgress, so that we don't trample on the toes of country experts. So we'll just give ourselves very broad brushstroke contours and be happy about that. I don't know if we'll be happy about that, but let's try. So you know that Zelensky comes in with an aura of optimism around him, as though he might be this outsider political candidate who might finally transform Ukraine's insuperable domestic political challenges and, above all, corruption. That aura had largely melted down by the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And Zelensky was, by then, already domestically unpopular. And of course, he underwent this extraordinary transformation at the beginning of the war because he stayed put, and because he grew in ownership so remarkably in the opening days of the war, which is actually quite a powerful illustration of the transformational role of individuals in history. And so he got a new aura on a high power. But that began to partly fragment in 2023 for at least a couple of reasons. One was that as domestic mobilization, psychological mobilization, plateaued a bit, domestic issues began to be re-legislated again. And so here Zelensky could again be viewed as the man who failed to deliver essential domestic reforms. And then he had a second problem, which is, of course, that his conception of victory lapsed. Partly because it was predicated on regime change in Moscow, because if you liberate out all Ukrainian territory, that doesn't actually stop the war. So there's a certain degree of incoherence in the language of "we'll free all Ukrainian territory," because that wouldn't have stopped the war. But more importantly, it ran aground because of Western strategic incapacity, secondary to democratic decline, which meant that we could only put a small fraction of the kind of pressure we would have put on Putin in 2023 if we had been a very democratically flourishing, consolidated and strategically potent bloc, which we're not in the West. And what Zelensky began to do was partly keep on talking about the conception, the original conception of victory that had melted down, even though it had melted down, and partly begin to frame another conception that has nevertheless remained elusive and unavailable. And along the way, some people could argue he engaged in some post-truth communication, but this was a very, very difficult thing for him to balance, short of himself having the kind of strategic vision which he doesn't have, but then neither do we, and neither does anybody else really involved in this conflict. That doesn't make it impossible to have, it just means nobody has it. Now, today, in 2025, a key pillar of legitimacy domestically for Zelensky is that he is seen as the guy who might bend Trump toward a sustainable outcome of the war for Ukraine, a sustainable cessation of the war, or a sustainable perpetuation of the war. That's an incredibly difficult thing for Zelensky to balance, partly because it's not clear how much leverage Trump can have over Putin. And Trump's already making various kinds of challenging remarks, for instance, remarks about the role of NATO expansion in Putin's invasion, which at a political level we have to reject as a narrative, no matter how long our analytical conversations about it might roll on. And indeed, it's perfectly reasonable to argue that NATO expansion could have been done differently, as Mary Surratt beautifully argues. But the point is that at a political level, you can't accede to Putin's conceptualization of the causes of war. Now, if negotiations happen, one of the things that Putin may want to put on the table is an issue that is already bloody difficult for Zelensky, and that's elections in Ukraine. And Trump may accede to that demand of Putin's. Now, today in Ukraine, Zelensky is recognized as the legitimate leader, but it's fair to generalize and say that his popularity is rather tanking. The popularity of his circle is tanking even faster, and the popularity of his party is tanking. And the folks who are popular tend to be the military folks, like Budanov or Zaluzhny. And Zaluzhny has a much higher popularity rating in Ukraine than Zelensky. And so the challenges that Zelensky faces around elections are, can they happen? And on the channels, we've been very sympathetic to the idea that it's bloody difficult to have elections for Ukraine under circumstances of war. So many reasons, right? So many people out of the country, so many people under Russian apartheid occupation, so many people at the front. But on top of can they happen, there's a question for Zelensky: does he run? And does he run against Zaluzhny, or does he try to get Zaluzhny not to run? Does he explore Zaluzhny running as part of Zelensky's package somehow? All of these really difficult questions are going to be exacerbated by the fact that this issue could be part of the negotiations. And of course, you don't forget that Mr. Putin is interested in anything he can possibly do to, small or big, to bring it about that Ukraine is less stable. So, Zelensky is stuck between this agent in the Kremlin who is obsessed with Ukraine's ungovernability and a buffoon president of the United States who doesn't have a clue how to end the war. But it's on Zelensky's capacity to inflect all of this stuff that, in good part, his domestic legitimacy centrally depends. Lots of love. Talk very soon.